On behalf of the Library Board of Victoria and all of my colleagues, good evening and welcome to the State Library. My name is Anne-Marie Schwedlich and I'm the CEO and State Librarian. Because of the strength of our institutional relationship and our enormous respect for Andrew Sayers' scholarship, it gives us great pleasure to have him with us, sharing his immense knowledge and abiding admiration for the art of portraiture. Andrew is the director of the National Portrait Gallery. He has headed Australia's first portrait gallery since its inception in 1998. Until recently, the National Portrait Gallery was at Old Parliament House in Canberra. The new, purpose-built National Portrait Gallery opened its doors in December last year to widespread critical acclaim. Andrew has extensive curatorial experience and has made a significant contribution to scholarly works on Australian art. Prior to his appointment to the National Portrait Gallery, Andrew worked at the Art Gallery of New South Wales and the Newcastle Regional Art Gallery before a 13-year stint at the National Gallery of Australia. So you see that he comes to us immensely qualified. Andrew has established the National Portrait Gallery as a significant institution working very closely with its board, and we're delighted that with us today is Marilyn Darling, who played a very significant role in the evolution of the institution and the beautiful premises in which it finds itself today. Andrew has seen the Portrait Gallery through a number of changes and transformations. His approach to the portrait painting genre is deeply considered and will challenge our expectations this evening. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Andrew to the lectern. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's a great pleasure to be here in Melbourne. And I would like to acknowledge the enormous contribution that the State Library of Victoria has made to our inaugural hang. So, tonight I'm going to talk about portraits of artists in their studios. And I'm going to begin with a quote. In 2002, the art writer Michael Kimmelmann paid a visit to the studio of the German painter Gerhard Richter in a suburb outside Cologne. In a piece for the New York Times, Kimmelmann wrote, "You can't miss Gerhard Richter's studio. It's a large, white, brick and concrete shoebox he designed several years ago, an industrial-looking building with a blank wall facing the street. In the studio, there is an office for a part-time secretary, a guest room, a small kitchen and a workshop for the assistant who stretches Richter's canvases and makes the architectural models by which Richter calculates, to the millimetre if possible, how his pictures should look in prospective galleries or museums. Beyond the workshop and a tiny open storage closet are the rooms where Richter paints, a large studio and a smaller one. Only operating rooms are this immaculate. Not a sheet of paper is on the secretary's black modular desk. Every roll of tape is kept in colour-coded order on designated hooks in the workshop. Brushes are stacked in drawers Richter custom designed on rolling shelves. After leaving a half-full coffee cup in the smaller studio one morning, I returned a short while later to find it gone and the desk wiped clean, although I never saw anybody enter or leave the room. When your works sell for millions of dollars as Richter's do at auction, you can indulge yourself if you are an obsessive compulsive. Richter's life, like his work, depends upon absolute control, and there is something both elegant and alarming about that condition. I began with this piece of studio scene setting because it neatly introduces my theme. In his piece, Michael Kimmelmann weaves a thread of connection between the way in which an artist works the environment in which he makes art, and the way in which that art behaves in the world after it has left the studio. The same set of connections lies behind the portraits of artists in their studios made by Ian Lloyd, currently on display here in the library. Kimmelman's description of his visit to Gerhard Richter, seen here in a photograph of around the same time, the early part of this century, also focuses on the minutiae of the environment in order to explore the artist's persona and how it might relate to the work. It's all about the telling details. Ian Lloyd's studio views are full of telling details. Artists give away a lot when they open up their studios, especially to the ruthlessly inclusive scrutiny of the large format camera. Ian Lloyd's photographs are part of a long tradition of pictures of artists in their studios. His stated interest in the studio is that he wants to understand and reveal the creative process. But there have been many different reasons for depicting artists in their studios. And tonight I want to look at some of the reasons and some of the history of the genre. We begin with Rembrandt, not because he was by any means the first artist to make paintings and drawings of artists at work in the studio, but because his painting Artist in His Studio, a painting of 1629, now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, introduces many of the possibilities of the subject. And they are introduced with Rembrandt's characteristic force and economy. It's a painting both specific and generalised. It's a self-portrait, but more generically, or more generally, it's a picture about the act of painting. The artist contemplates a canvas. Tonally and compositionally, it is the canvas, huge canvas, on its sturdy easel that dominates the picture. The subject, though, is all in the mind. We don't see what the artist is painting. It's been suggested that the expanse of space between the artist and the canvas suggests that the artist is in an early stage in the conceptual process of creating a picture. Perhaps the painting he's working on hasn't even yet been begun. Perhaps the artist is carrying out the instruction common to artists of his day, which was to stand at a distance and first make the painting in the mind before putting the brush into the paint. One of the best writers on Rembrandt, Ernst van der Wettering, who was the director of the Rembrandt project, has concluded that this is a picture of an artist thinking. Not painting, but thinking about painting. And he adds weight to his interpretation by remarking that artists in Rembrandt's day sat down to paint. In this painting, you can actually see the indentations on the crossbar of the easel. It's been worn away by the feet of the artist resting there as he sits before the painting. So, if you were a painter in the 17th century in the Netherlands, you stood up to think and you sat down to paint. Artists still do that, of course. Here is Ian Lloyd's Rembrandt-toned portrait of Robert Hannaford, standing in thought before the emerging self-portrait. And here is the late James Gleeson, sitting at the easel, painting. Just before we leave Rembrandt's studio view, I think it's interesting how some elements of the studio have remained consistent over hundreds of years. Rembrandt had easels hanging on the wall, and here's Ricamore. I'm sure he won't mind a casual comparison to Rembrandt. His easels propped up on a shelf on the studio wall. Rembrandt's artist in the studio is about concept. So too is one of the other great 17th century Dutch studio views, this one painted by Vermeer. This is Vermeer's The Art of Painting, painted around 1666 to 1667, and now in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. As its title makes clear, and we're pretty certain that this, or a variant of it, was in fact Vermeer's own title for the work. As it makes clear, it's actually meant to be a painting about the act of painting, the art of painting, not an everyday view of the artist's work in the studio. As in many Dutch paintings of the period, the picture's loaded with allegorical meanings and references, in fact enough to keep a cottage industry of art historians going for decades. For example, the girl has been identified, the model, as one of the muses, the muse of history, Clio. But the amassing of allegorical meanings has not stopped scholars poring over this picture for clues about Vermeer's actual studio practice. Can the painter have dressed in that elaborate garb to paint? Well, probably not. His very elaborate slashed top is probably as much fancy dress as the model decked out as the muse Clio. And we'd have to say this is a pretty clean studio. Where's the messiness that you expect in an artist's studio? Well, in Vermeer's case, the answer is upstairs, because we know from an inventory of his studio made after his death that Vermeer had a room in the attic above his studio where he ground and mixed his paint. Incidentally, that inventory lists chairs, tables, drapes and books, but rather maddeningly and frustratingly for the sleuthing art historian, no detailed listing of brushes, pigments, or the other things that the artist might have picked up on a trip to Eckersley's. This painting, The Art of Painting, is dated 1666. A slightly earlier work from the same decade by another Dutch artist shows a very different studio view. Adrian van Ostad's Artist in his Studio, very gloomy by comparison with the Vermeer. But we can see enough, and we can see more in a print, which works better when projected, made after a similar painting. There are lots of studio views in his oeuvre. When we look at this, we think, that's more like a studio. There's mess and there's clutter. There's no abstracted contemplation, but actually an artist at work, and we can see all of the studio paraphernalia. We can see paints. We can see assistants mixing paint. We can see on the shelf there a lay figure, and there's various brushes sitting in pots of paint, and so on. So it looks like a real workshop. But although at first sight these pictures are about the painter at work, they're very much also about the act and the art of painting. You'll notice that what the artist is painting on the canvas is not a scene that he's looking at in front of him. There's no model. The artist is imaginatively conjuring up a different place, a landscape. He's elsewhere. The artist seems to be making an explicit statement about the act of painting, a process that can transform this world into another place. Everything in the studio is undergoing a magical transformation from the mundane and slightly chaotic flow of everyday things into a painting, probably a painting of a transcendent, mythical, religious or allegorical subject, or a landscape, but set in some otherworldly time and place. This looks like we would imagine an alchemist's laboratory to look. Indeed, it is, I think, a picture of the studio as an alchemist's laboratory. Earthy pigments and fluids are transformed through some artist's magic into objects of transcendent beauty. What is art, other than the transformation, the magical almost transformation of materials into images or forms that speak to us? And it's that transformation which is a constant theme in the depictions of artists in their studios. And that comes right up to our own time. One of the most poetic pieces written about a visit to an artist in the studio was that written by the French writer Jean Genet. Genet's essay Alberto Giacometti's Studio was written in 1958. It's only relatively recently been translated into English. And it's a beautiful piece of writing that gets into the heart of the material transformation that happens deep in the studio space. Genet spent many hours in the sculptor's dilapidated house cum studio at a time when Giacometti had already developed an international reputation as one of Europe's most significant post-war sculptors. And this is a picture of Giacometti. This is what Jean Genet wrote. Since the statues Giacometti is currently working on are very tall, when he stands in front of them, they're in brown clay, his fingers rise and fall like those of the gardener pruning or grafting a climbing rose. His fingers play along the length of the statue, and the whole studio vibrates and comes to life. I have the curious impression that if he's there, without him touching them, the old, already finished statues change and are transformed because he's working at one of their sisters. Anyway, this ground floor studio is going to cave in any day now. It's made of worm-eaten wood, grey powder, and the statues are in plaster, with the rope, stuffing or wire showing, and the canvases painted in grey have lost the tranquillity they had at the art shop long ago. Everything is stained and ready for the bin. Everything is precarious and about to collapse. Everything is going to dissolve. Everything is floating. And yet all this seems to be captured in some absolute reality. When I've left the studio, when I'm out in the street, that is when nothing that surrounds me is true. Shall I say it? In that studio, a man is slowly dying, wasting away, metamorphosing into goddesses before our very eyes. So in Genet's imagination, the act of creation goes beyond the transformation of materials. This is nothing short of a metamorphosis, the literal absorption of the artist into his work. Giacometti's tiny studio, that paint-encrusted and plaster-dusted cave, was a great subject for the artist himself. He drew it many times and painted it many times. This is one of his paintings simply called Interior from 1949, a view of the corner of the studio. We get some of the sense of the layering that created that environment in a painting like this. And the best photographs of Giacometti's studio, the ones in which you don't get a sense that the space is being invaded by an unwelcome guest, are these photographs taken by Ernst Scheidegger, who visited Giacometti over a 20-year period from 1943 until Giacometti's death. This particular photograph of the artist at work was taken in 1953. Wonderful pictures of the creative process. You couldn't actually get a studio that's further away from the pristine space of Gerhard Richter that we began with. And I want shortly to return to the subject of the messy studio as a metaphor for the creative process. But first, let's just follow for a moment the idea of the studio as an allegory of the art of painting. If the metaphorical dimensions of Vermeer's The Art of Painting are a source of some speculation, they pale by comparison with the vast statement made by the French 19th century painter Courbet. In 1855, Courbet, by then a major realist painter on the Parisian art scene, exhibited a vast canvas entitled The Painter's Studio, a real allegory summing up a 7-year phase of my artistic life. People don't give titles to pictures like that anymore, do they? Oh, maybe Dale Frank does. Despite giving the painting that rather extensive and descriptive title, the artist was deliberately enigmatic when it came to identifying the people in this picture. In a letter to a friend in the year that it was painted, Courbet wrote, "It's fairly mysterious and it'll keep people guessing." Well, wasn't he right? The painting and its interpretation have generated a vast literature. What Courbet did say was that there are two sides to this painting. Courbet identified the people on the right as shareholders, he described them, friends, supporters, workers and devotees of the art world. People such as the very recognisable Baudelaire there. And the figures on the left, Courbet identified as, quote, the other world of trivial life, the people, misery, poverty, wealth, the exploited and the exploiters, the people who live off of death, end of quote. Only some of these people can be identified with any precision. We know pretty much who most of the people on the supporters' side are, but this more suggestive world is a bit more difficult. And all of this world that Courbet creates in his studio revolve around a self-portrait of the artist at work. He's working on a characteristic landscape painting. The child who looks on can plausibly be taken as a symbol of the purity of vision which every landscape painter seeks to achieve. And the nude woman clearly is not included in Courbet's painting, is, I think, in the context of so deliberately allegorical a picture, allegorical of both nature, capital N, and painting, capital P. The reason there's built up such a vast body of literature about this painting is not that it includes a huge amount of actual information about the artist's studio practice, but because it was a grand summary statement of the artist's view of his place in the world. And that world is a world, albeit an imaginary one, that is outside the studio. It's a world of his own place and his own time and society, which of course was core material for the realist artist. One of the characteristics you'll notice in Ian Lloyd's photographic portraits of Australian artists in the studio exhibition is that they are almost always alone in the studio with their work. That actually comes from a different tradition from this of Courbet. This really comes from the tradition of the artist as a monastic, which is ideally expressed, I think, in this portrait, painted in 1811 of the German painter Caspar David Friedrich. It's painted by his friend Georg Friedrich Kirsting. And Kirsting, when he wrote about Friedrich, paid tribute to Friedrich's inner eye. And I think the idea of the inner eye is really what we're seeing here. Shut off from the world, apart from its gorgeous light. The painter paints something from his own imaginative resources. And it's an idea that comes through very strongly in depictions of artists in their studios. Some of the appeal of the exhibition studio is that we share the photographer's penetration of that monastic space, if I can call it that, that intimate space, that workshop, the sanctum sanctorum in which the artist works. The photographer doesn't let us actually see much of an outside world, and only a couple of occasions in the exhibition do we get a sense that there are other people around the artist. Robin Wallace Crabbe is seen at work in front of a model, a figure of undoubted flesh and blood, a Matissean dream, very much herself, not an allegorical fancy, such as the figure in Courbet's painting. And no doubt the circumstances captured in the workspace of Regina Wilson, working here in the midst of friends and relatives, is an accurate description of the lives of many artists, not only Indigenous artists, but artists being interrupted and having duties towards others, as well as at times being left alone to concentrate on the productions of their solitary labours.